And we round out this season, I guess, with my series. And my series has also been making the rounds a decent amount on social media. I, at the start, and up until very recently, I did not want to cover this series at all. But due to some statements I saw, I decided to cover it, and now I'm here. I am covering Tsuma, Shougakusei ni naru, also known as If My Wife Became an Elementary School Student, also abbreviated as TsumaSho. So this is a manga original by author Yayu. He's done some other works with this sort of similar premise of like time skips and stuff like that, or at least supernatural themes such as Unjo ni Unjo ni Utaite Kimi o Matsu, as well as Okashiki Sekai no Kyoukai-sen. So a lot of these sorts have supernatural themes and stuff like that in them. The anime production is led by uh, Saint Signpost or Street Signpost, Saint Signpost, Street Signpost, I want to say, Studios, who has overseen production for Kingdom season three through five. Most recently, I believe 1 or 2 seasons ago, My Clueless First Friend. They worked on some smaller stuff such as like Oda Cinema Nobunaga, but mostly their work has been involved with being subcontractors for stuff like in between or second key animation work. They are getting some help in terms of photography and 3D CGI and in their animation production by Graphitica Studios, who longtime listeners of this podcast might know. They are pretty standard and prolific standard subcontractor for stuff like photography work, as well as us to a slightly lesser extent working on 3D CGI as well as CG composition work. So that they've been kind of working that in a little bit more in the recent years, but most of their main work and portfolio is in photography work. So for this anime adaptation, Street Signpost brought together veteran director Noriyuki Abe alongside a bunch of people from sort of who has like a variety of experience. So some people have some are sort of newer entries into the industry up until you have people with just some a decent amount of experience, I want to say, throughout the years, but none of these are sort of stand out super veteran prolific names, especially in terms of like recent works. So a lot of the I want to say this is a little bit more of a slight hodgepodge of slightly lesser experienced staff working on this series, which is a very interesting composition to have underneath Noriyuki Abe. So Noriyuki Abe, for those of you or who might not know, he helped direct a lot of the later Bleach and Black Butler movies and OVAs. He was the director for Great Teacher Onizuka, GTO. He worked on Yu Yu Hakusho stuff. He was director for Tokyo Mew Mew, Flame of Rekka, Rekka no Hono, as well as Hero Legend of Arslan. So he is quite a prolific director. And again, he brings together this sort of hodgepodge group of people who are not necessarily all like super veterans, but have some experience under their belt. In terms of the voice acting cast, the main sort of two characters, I want to say the the male character, as well as the husband in this case, as well as the reincarnated wife, quote unquote reincarnated wife, are voice acted by two prolific veterans of the industry. The wife in question, voiced by Yuki Aoi, who is sort of obviously a very good fit for this role because she's pressed upon to act out both the older wife role, right? The adult wife role, as well as the kid role. And guess which voice actress is very good at doing both a more older adult role, especially now that she's gotten on in age, as well as doing a kid role, right? Like a bratish kid role. It is Yuki Aoi. So, pretty much a perfect fit if you want to find an A-list actress for this role. But yeah, it was very good. She is able to do this bit of a deeper adult tone for the reincarnated adult wife, in those adult scenes, or in the adult wife scenes. Um, Especially since again she's gotten on age and she has that sort of like deeper voice now available to her. But she's also able to pull out this sort of bratty kid voice when she needs to, which is very convenient since they don't need to hire different voice actresses, right? Uh, so her older voice does almost not sound like Yugi Aoi. It does almost sound like a separate character, but she does fail to hide her Yukiao's unique inflections. And those of you who don't, those of you who know Yuki Aoi know what I mean when I say like these like unique inflections, like like when she kind of like has like unique like register, like kind of like tonal thing in her voice. That sort of like keeps popping up here and there at times. So it was almost a good try, but it's like she still has that like Yuki Aoi voice, which is interesting. Um, the main male character the husband in this case is voiced by Hirakawa Daisuke. You guys might know him through his three most famous roles in Ryugazaki Rei in Free, Makoto in the infamous School Days, as well as Kakyoin in JoJo's Stardust Crusaders. He as well as he does a lot of like supporting roles in other series such as like Enmu and Demon Slayer. But yeah, those two prolific veterans are kind of buffeted by um, mostly an experienced cast of like veterans, with the exception of like a couple of newer up and comers in supporting cast roles, such as Nomoru Maiko and Okazaki Kana, doing a couple of the smaller roles there. So that's sort of it. Sort of the two prolific veterans, kind of really taking the lead in this case. Going over to the OPED and the audio visuals here, the opening is I Know Reunion by Apache. So Pache is a three-man J-pop band out of Osaka. They sort of self-label themselves as a quote-unquote hybrid city pop group band or style, right?
Uh-huh.
It is a very interesting composition, especially the main vocal line. The song itself isn't bad, but I want to say the overall storyboarding of the opening is very slow and early 2000s kind of style, where it's just like, oh, this character is running along the hill or running along the road, and then another character gets introduced, and then the characters are eating bentos or they're at an amusement park, and it's a very like standard, like slow, oh, this is this character, this character, this that character kind of thing that you would see in like again a standard 2000s rom-com kind of style anime series. um the storyboarding doesn't really fit. I don't think it fits the song very well, which is unfortunate. And I think overall, it's just the visual OP part is a little bit mediocre. The ending is the song is Hidamari by Miss Oja. Miss Oja is a hip hop slash R&B singer songwriter out of Nagoya. In this case, she sings a very standard, slower ballad style J-pop and song. Um, I would say it's both composition in terms of the song as well as the storyboard are both very nondescript. It's just kind of what you would see. It's a lot of like slow cuts, like PowerPoint cuts of, not PowerPoints, but static cuts of like them kind of sitting next to each other or looking at each other or sitting by the hill or by the riverside or whatever stuff like that, right? These very like romantic, sappy scenes. But it's really nondescript. It's something that you've seen in a slice of life or a rom-com ED or a romance ED a billion times. So both OPED pretty nondescript here. Excuse me. Going over to the audio visuals real quick. The OST is nondescript. I'll just get that out of the way. And I want to say when it goes into the dramatic scenes, the the brass comes in way too strong. The brass, I was just like, I'm just like watching the scene where the husband is learning about the truth of the situation of this like supernatural premise situation, and it's like this orchestral, the violins are stirring up, and usually what happens is um usually what happens in these sorts of moments, like a very standard orchestral thing to do is like you would have maybe like some synth, but it's like a lot of it would be like violin or general like strings tremolo, and you would be like, it would be like that suspense kind of thing, like right, like while he's awaiting he's like learning of the drama, right? But for some reason in this case, you have like while I was listening, it's just like, wait, like why is the brass so loud in the background? It's just like it's very it's a little bit too big and like on the nose for me in terms of these situations. So I think the OST was a little bit weird. Other than that, it's very nondescript overall. I wasn't too impressed by it. In terms of visuals, the models themselves are pretty standard. They match up pretty decently with the original character designs. But in terms of the lines that are drawn in terms of like the animation frames, right? The as well as the shading, as well as the tones and the palettes of the different character models seem to be done with a lot of CG and maybe potential AI tech, and it kind of makes it look like each of the character models look like one of those like 4K. They popped out from one of those like 4K remaster videos, right?
Uh-huh.
The biggest thing though, and this even like this is not this wouldn't be a really criticism in and of itself. These character models sit in direct contrast with just like the very standard like pastel kind of style background art. You know what I'm talking about, right? Where it's like the trees are all have like the oil painting kind of
Yeah.
pastel, like like lack of lines, right? Art, and it creates this like weird jarring effect that I don't really like, where it's like the character models are all very clearly defined and like they have this like gloss, right? Um, but then the background art is just like, oh, it's just kind of like trees. So it's a very weird contrast that I'm not really sure that I like. I think um the other stuff in terms of like the 3D modeling of the inanimate objects and so on are done fine because obviously I think they're being headed by like Graphinica and so on, right? But um let me actually but yeah, it's like uh the 3D inanimate models and so on are all fine, but it's like a lot of the shading is a little bit weird. Um, the animations themselves, like when characters are running and so on, look actually pretty smooth in the way the blending is done with like 3D models. When the action is actually required, is pretty well done. Again, as expected of working with Graphinica. But I think this just like sometimes the way the character models are done. Like, look at this like sort of shading here, right? I just posted it. Uh, it's like there's this like weird contrast between the character models and the background art that it's like bugging me.
Yeah, I see
But
what you mean where it's kind of like especially this
yeah.
like the businessman by the sign, he kind of just looks like he's
Y-
sort of layered there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like the model himself isn't bad, but it's like then you see the background on it, you're like, what? Okay.
Yeah.
Like kind of thing. So that was a little bit unfortunate in terms of the visuals, I want to say. So last, I guess we'll move on to the story. And I said last, but this is like the biggest part of the review because TsumaSho is a lot to unpack. So I want to say beforehand, disclaimer, I have not read the manga original. I believe Toast has. He can, clue me into stuff as I talk, but I have not read the manga original. So take that as you will. Um, so the
We should also
TLDR,
make a disclaimer that you're not a pedophile.
yeah, I am also not a federal. Just getting that out there. So TLDR, the main character, the male protagonist slash husband, Niichiba Keisuke, has lost his beloved wife, Takae, 10 years ago. So after that, he's been all gloomy all day. He doesn't talk to anybody at the company. He's just like, oh, whatever. He's not very productive. And he also like barely cares for his daughter. Right. It's not like he like hates her or whatever, but it's like essentially they're just living in the same house, but they're not like he's not caring for his daughter, who I believe her name is Mai. Yeah. So they're essentially just stopped in time. They're like dead dead men walking or dead daughter walking, whatever. Um, so every day is kind of drab and gloomy because the wife passed away until a kid appears in front of Nijima's house, appears in front of the husband and daughter's house, and claims that she is the reincarnation of the wife, Takai. And then from there, these sorts of like character developments happen where, you know, they talk with each other. There's like a lot of discussions and conversations, and the daughter and the husband kind of have brighten up their lives, talk with the reincarnated wife on like what's been going on, like how should they move forward. They start expanding, like the story starts world building, adds in new characters, adds in new members of the cast, like the reincarnated wife, because she's like an elementary school girl, right? She obviously has her own family, so there's like developments on that side. And then the daughter starts, you know, not necessarily networking, but she starts meeting new people, and there's developments there. And the guy, the main protagonist, the male character, goes around, interacts with all these different cast members. He also has people at work that he interacts with, and that sort of world building in terms of characters develops there. And so that's the sort of general flow. And in general, the uh, there's like slice of life episodic stuff at the beginning, but for the most part, it develops into general like larger arcs. So it's like you'll have an arc of like four or five, however many episodes, and then another arc of like X episodes. It's sort of how the structure is in the anime. But yeah, it's mainly composed of arcs that are focused around one or two characters' developments. So, then yeah. Uh, Again, I guess second disclaimer here that I forgot to do earlier on. I'm not averse to watching a series with premises that may seem like it crosses the line initially, right? Or even if it does just fully cross the line, right? Like I've watched Yosuga no Sora. I've watched Akisora. I've watched, you know, all this stupid shit, right? Kodomo no Jikan. Did I watch the
Yeah.
anime? I think I watched
I'd be
I think I
surprised.
read the manga. Yeah.
I thought Ritsu would have made you watch that
Yeah,
by
force me.
force.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like I've watched this stuff, but um obviously the degenerate part aside, when I'm actually trying to review a series like this, I have slightly higher expectations because it has to uphold a premise that is initially less appealing for me to watch, right? So it has to have correspondingly a greater draw for me to continue to watch it, right? So that's just a second disclaimer out of the way. Um, Going into the analysis, again, I don't want to spoil too much. The premise is obviously a little bit weird and railroaded because duh, an elementary schooler freaking appears in front of your house, in front of the MC's house, and it's like, I'm your wife. It's like, you know, it's railroaded, right? Um, and
What's the
the
lore
problem is
behind
like
that? Did she
the
just
lore
like
behind that.
did she just like appear or did she like take over another child's consciousness?
It's the latter. It's spoilers, I guess, but it's like
Damn,
it's the latter.
that's
But
fucked up.
um, but it's like not really that important though ultimately. But it's like the ending result depends the ending result and how this kind of resolves at the end of the day depends a lot of the ultimate interactions and the character development of the three characters, the wife, the husband, and the daughter, obviously. Um, the issue is it's like the theme or like how the story should quote unquote be resolved, right? Is sort of already set up 90% of the way in the first episode, in the first conversation and the initial kind of um love triangle slash romance subplot setup. So obviously the MC had so the male main character, male husband, right? The husband has a coworker, a female coworker at the office that is in love with him, and obviously that becomes a kind of romance subplot. Like, will they? Won't they? Kind of. Oh, but I have a wife, and she's like the spirit of her is in this child, and like I like talking to her, and like what the hell is this kind of thing? So that becomes a subplot, and then
That's fucking
um
weird. It's
yeah, and then the wife kind of tells off both the husband and the daughter. It's like you gotta continue living your lives. Like you can't rely on me all the time. Like what is this kind of thing? You can't let times just stop. So that sort of this sort of like how it's gonna resolve is already kind of 90% set up in episode 1. Um, After that, it's a lot of just like again the world building, how the characters develop, and kind of move towards the ultimate resolution of the story. Um, there's a lot. I have like a lot of notes on here, so I want to. It's like I have notes on here, but it's not ordered very well. Sorry. So I'm gonna try to order as much as possible from like top level down. What I'll say is like it's a little bit the way the story, the pacing is the pacing of the character developments is good. It's fast, it's steady. So it's like there's a lot of things like constantly happening where it's like you'll have this drama happening and then boom, it gets kind of like sort of resolved ish. And then you'll have new characters come in and then they'll talk about their stuff and their problems. And then that sort of gets resolved. And then a new development, boom, 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 down the line. The issue is, despite having this good pacing, the overall story seems a bit aimless while also having too many objectives to juggle. And what I mean by that is it feels a bit aimless because it it feels like the author is has kind of put out these characters with problems out into the world, right? And it's like you have this premise like, oh, how are they going to get back to how are they going to get back to, their own regular lives, or how are they going to find happiness or whatever, right? But it's like there's a lot of ways that there's at least a couple of ways that this could sort of the characters could develop in theory, right? Although in practicality, there's only one or two ways the story standard usually works out. Um, so reason why it feels aimless is ultimately the question, the theme, right, is a little bit too vague, right? It's just like, how are you going to find happiness? How are you just going to move on? Which, is not really a question that is answered in a succinct way in a literary story properly, right? Or it can't really be properly answered in a literary story, especially if it's adapted into an anime of 12 episodes or whatever, however many episodes. And yet, the objectives just on face, right? Like uh the happiness of the father has and like where he's going has to be resolved, the husband. The happiness of the daughter has to be resolved, although that's a lesser problem overall. The happiness of the
It's true.
reincarnated wife
Daughters are not
slash
as
the
important as father.
yeah, they they are lesser beings. They yearn for the mind, so fuck them.
True.
Fuck them kids. Yeah. uh, the the problems of the reincarnated wife slash the daughter and her like family has to be kind of resolved. Everything kind of has to tie back together, and the supernatural occurrence has to be resolved. And so SumaSho is in this weird setting where it both has too many objectives to juggle, and at the same time, because the objectives are so kind of vague, where it's like, oh, how is the husband going to find happiness? Kind of is because it's so vague. The way it has to build its story, the way it has to talk about these things becomes very kind of aimless in a sense. So, um, i- oh yeah, and on top of that, not only are there these sorts of story objectives, but it also needs to have because it is a slice of life. It needs to have this like these bits of peaceful after story slice of life scenes and stuff like that. Um, And it's just like there's a lot of things going on and a lot of the objectives are vague. So the way it develops is a little bit too like it doesn't feel like it's aiming to properly resolve the story, even though the pacing and like there's a lot of things happening on the screen. So it's a very weird feeling. Um
So I have a kind of big
yeah.
question. And this is kind of like the only thing on my mind when I look at the show.
Mm,
Does this series acknowledge at all the fact that uh the wife being around is
mm.
incredibly unhealthy to them like grieving and moving on? Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's like one of the center things, I guess. But it's not so by center I mean it's very interesting the way interesting being charitable. It's interesting the way the story handles it because it's almost like a ReZero Amelia situation where part that sort of sometimes gets like shunted off to the side. It's like, don't think about that. Although it's like the main premise of the story, don't think about that for a while. We need to resolve this other arc of like
Awesome.
drama, blah blah. And then that gets resolved, and then all right, we're back to this whole like should we really have like this reincarnated wife in the body of this kid? Like, is this a good thing? Kind of business, right? So they do answer it a little bit more in the later questions, and obviously it becomes a main point of resolution, right? Because the reincarnated wife can't be in the kid forever. Um, but or the spirit of the wife can't be in the kid forever. But sometimes it kind of just gets rudely shunted off to the side, and it's like, wait, hold up. We need to develop this other character. And so it's a very again, this is why I keep saying, right? There's so many things to juggle, and a lot of these things are like big and like vague. Uh so no matter how much of this like shunting and reorganizing and okay, we're gonna resolve this pace or we're gonna resolve the character's arc, and then boom, 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 2 episodes in, we're gonna bring this other character, and then we're gonna have romance and blah blah. No matter how fast the pacing is, it's just like there's too much to do, and so much of it's like it's hard to do, right? So that's the sort of problem I feel. One of the problems I feel with the series. The second sort of section of slight criticisms I have with the series is that the way a lot of this world building and story structure kind of pans out in terms of how does the husband find the happiness? How does the daughter find her happiness? How blah blah. It's a lot of at least on one major side of the cast. I'll talk about the exceptions to this in a little bit later. The fact that the husband and the daughter's sort of world building and how they get sort of hurdled towards their story objectives of finding happiness end up kind of devolving into these like base romantic subplots, which is less than impressive. And a lot of the way that along the way, like the drama points, right? Stuff like this implied love triangle or like, oh, do you really like me or whatever this is, right? Stuff like that. Um, a lot of the way that the drama points happen in these romance subplots, the way they start and the way they resolve in the series is a little bit too on the nose and one dimensional. Like you can see the moment that like the scene occurs, or even before the scene occurs, when the foreshadowing happens. Uh, you can see how it will start and how it will resolve from pretty much a mile away if you've read more than like one manga series or even like a book, right? So it's a little bit unfortunate that a lot of the world building, a lot of the character development, and like, oh, um, like I've become a happier person due to XYZ events. These XYZ events kind of just end up being very simple base again, romantic manga subplots that you've seen a billion times at a very basic level. So that's a little bit unfortunate. Um, I think the the exception to this is actually the story with the reincarnated wife slash the daughter's mother. And honestly, that's currently the best part of the series, hands down. The stuff, the trials and tribulations that she goes through, like the realizations that she realizes that the spirit of another person's wife is stuffed into her daughter and how she resolves that, stuff like that. Um, that's like way better. This story is like way better than anything else in the entire series so far. And the author sort of realizes this because this arc sort of becomes the centerpiece of the story for like X number of it's like for way more episodes than you would think it it would get because this is if you think about it, right? It's like that's not really the main initial hook of the story, right? Of this series. Because the main hook of this series is to any outsider, it's how the husband and the daughter recover over time, right? After meeting up with the daughter, right? But the story kind of pulls away from that for a good while and kind of just turns into, yeah, how's the daughter's mother doing? Like how's the reincarnated wife's daughter as daughter's mother doing, and how is she dealing with all the stress? And that sort of takes reign over the series for a while. And I think the author kind of realized halfway, it's like, wait a minute, this character is like way better than all the other characters that I wrote in this story. So it's a little bit of an unfortunate thing in a sense, but I mean that part of the story is good, so that's nice. And I think that honestly, for me, this part is the only thing that really boots the story up a couple of points. Otherwise, I would have given it a much worse score than I have before. Although there are still a lot of things dragging down. I would say also in terms of like the romance and how the romance subplots and how the drama and the themes of like leaving the past behind, stuff like that. A little bit too much on the nose, a little bit too many repetitive elements outside of again the story with the mother, right? Um, and I also think that this is a little bit nitpicky for me, but a lot of these like stories, right, are being run, or this entire story, right, is being run concurrently. Right. It's not like Orb, for instance, right, where there's this like time skip or like this like shift in like kind of yeah, like this like disjoint between eras of time, right? So the important thing in when you're running this sort of concurrent story is switching screen time, right? That's an additional difficulty, but it's like you have to do this thing where you're developing the story of one character and then like you kind of switch over to the story of another character because they are all these events are supposedly happening in real time. But the way this series works, at least in the anime adaptation, is that the character development is done almost strictly like one at a time. Like this entire arc is set up to develop these one or two characters, kind of, and then afterwards you'll have like one or two episodes where it develops the daughter's character a little bit, and by development, I mean, you know, um, base romance subplot, right? And then you'll have like this entire arc where, we're diving into the supernatural. And that's sort of, delving a little bit more into the interactions between the husband and the wife, right? And so these things are being taken one by one in the timeline, right? Like this arc happens in the timeline before this arc, and then the next arc happens after the timeline. They are not happening concurrently, in the story. So I think that's a little bit iffy because it's like you're aware of how time flows in the story, right? And kind of seeing this one arc get hyper focused on, and then in the meanwhile, all the other characters that are not really as relevant to the arc just get shunted off to the side, right? And they're just like, "Oh, you're just like just deal with some here, have some romance subplot. Just go off to the side, and we're gonna focus on this character." And I think that's a little bit iffy, like once you notice that. So uh, this also goes double because for this also goes double for the husband arc because the later husband arc where the husband has to deal with the supernatural implications of the the daughter with the spirit of the wife in her, right, is not very good we're trying to because the husband arc is trying to dual wield or kind of juggle both the husband's character development, right? The husband needs to find the happiness and resolve and blah blah blah. But at the same time, the overall story is trying to work out this like weird supernatural premise of whether she's reincarnated or being possessed by the spirit or however this is going to resolve, right? And so they're doing that juggling thing, and the entire story is kind of focusing on that. At the same time, again, all the other characters are kind of getting shunted off to the side in terms of like their main character development. So I think the way it's being juggled is a little bit iffy. And again, it doesn't in these cases, it doesn't really matter how fast the pacing and how fast the development is. There's just too much to do. There's too much to do, and there's too big. The story objectives are too big in this case to handle with any amount of pacing speed. Um, and the supernatural parts coming in, obviously are not very good either, but I think ultimately in this case they're a little bit necessary. The way it's resolved obviously is necessary because it's like, the beginning was railroaded, right? The beginning was literally an elementary school girl knocking. It's like, hey, I'm your wife. So ultimately, the ending also sort of needs to be shoehorned in. But um, I do think that there are potentially more natural endings to be had with the supernatural premise. Although obviously, I have not finished the series yet. Um, The so yeah, I think that's pretty much sort of what I wanted to say about this. The comedy in itself is sort of pretty bland and it's like standard fare of like, oh, you're fawning over a lolly kind of thing. Again, the stuff I talked about before, right? Where it's like there's a story development of like the one or two characters, right? And then everybody else that's not related to the arc is kind of shunted off to this like romance subplot on the side. And that like romance subplot, um, when it gets shunted off to these like storage containers on the side while the main arc is developing, it's just like very only given like paltry consolatory token. Here's the bento I made. Do you like it? Or like we should go on a date together. Like that's like all the fuel that sort of like romantic subplot kind of gets until the main arc gets resolved. And this is sort of what I mean by it kind of looks iffy, right? Because you had this main arc and it's like, oh, the characters and the story, blah blah. And then like, what's going on with all the other characters? Oh, they're off on this date, and here's the bento I made. And it's like what's going on here? Like, are we working with the same characters at the same time? What's happening? So it's a very unfortunate, I think, juxtaposition of of the main arc alongside the subplots. So uh, overall, I think from what I'm seeing, the overall resolution that I predict will kind of I'm not sure if it's going to pan out very well. I feel like instead of digging in too hard into the supernatural premise, I would have preferred sort of like a Junmaida key animation, like Klana sort of ending, where it's like it only hints at the supernatural, but overall it kind of pans out smoothly into happy ending. But that's not what the author wanted, so here we are. Um, at the end of the day, I think again, as I said before, this series had to satisfy higher standards than usual, as expected, to help support the fact that this premise was less than appealing. Let's be straight up about it, like upfront about it, as well as
Okay,
B.
Wokey.
Okay. You like I can't believe you wouldn't support a premise where a schoolgirl, elementary schoolgirl is trying to hug like 40-year-old man. Um but yeah, and B, the fact that both the premise and the cast, like how the cast managed to like meet up and connect with each other's story, was quite a bit railroaded. It's a little bit forced in the story. Um Unfortunately, the series did not meet my expectations with what I wanted from the story to satisfy this sort of forced premise. Again, the pacing is okay, but ultimately there are just too many story objectives. There are too many vague story objectives, which sort of makes the structure of the story flow seem a little bit too aimless and like, how are we going to get towards happiness kind of business? And the way that the character developments play out are in terms of again the romance subplots, in terms of the drama points within those romance subplots, are a little bit too run of the mill and honestly obvious without even needing to watch the story. So again, the problems I have is not with the premise so much. It's just it's just there's too many things that are cheesy and all the nose, and it's just not juggled well in the story, I think. So I think pretty much like the audio visuals, whatever, uh, the story. Excuse me. Sorry, I had to sneeze. The story overall, pretty much most of the things inside it, I think, are sort of dragging it down, except for again the story with the mother. of the reincarnated wife kid, um, which really is honestly the crown jewel, the North Star of this series. Without it, I would have probably given it a much worse score, but overall, I would have probably give it a 3.5 or 4 out of 10. Um,
Damn.
and this is a
Bro's
yeah, this
about to
is
give this
this
shit
got
a 0, dude. What the fuck?
yeah, I would have given it a 0. That's not I mean, it's like okay, but it's like um yeah, it's like part of it probably also does have to do with the truncation as well. It's like similar stuff that happened with something like Wreck back in the early days. Um, Probably also similar to like the tonal differences between something like a Kodomo no Jikan anime, which had a much more like uh, active tone, right? Something like a Majikoi anime, which had a much more energetic tone compared to the subdued tone of like the manga and the visual novel originals. But the core of the story is still a little bit, I think a little bit not hashed out properly, or I think it would be I think I would appreciate if it had a little bit more organic resolutions. But I know this got like a 7.25 on Mal. Um yeah, uh, I don't think I can give it I think if this was I think if this was the early 2000s, right? I think if this was the early 2000s, late 2000s, maybe even early 2010s, I could have given this a 5 or 6 out of 10. I could have given this a 6 out of 10 if this was early 2000s or late 2000s. In the year 2024, like the kid issue aside, it's a little bit hard for me to give it a higher score just because the novelty factor has worn off on a lot of these sorts of like story structures. So again, um, I'll say 4 out of 10. I'll say 4 out of 10, but it's a little bit hard for me to give it at least the anime adaptation on an above average score. So fortunate, but it is what it is. And again, I want to say it's not because of the premise. It's just a very unfortunate story structure. So, but yeah, that was my review of TsumaSho. This is Tsuma Shougakusei ni Naru. And I apologize to anybody who might have, you know, wished potentially more positive review coming from it. I know this is like a very sort of uh, a little bit more uncommon premise that heralds um, this sort of like familial drama and stuff like that. But it is what it is. I'm talking about a review, talking about sort of how the story structures pan out in the series. So yeah, that was my review of TsumaSho. This was done by Street Spotlight or Stage Light or whatever it's called, right? Sorry, not Street Signpost. Yeah, Street Signpost. Um, and headed by again veteran director Abe Noriyuki. So, uh, I would suggest if you are more interested in this series, you'd be it would be best for you to just read the manga. Just read the manga. I always say this advice, just read the original. But in this case, you should really just read the original. I think that would be a better choice.